Hello and welcome to the seventh session of the concept of acceleration with Nick Land. I'm going to pass the camera off to him.
Okay, thanks for that, Theo. So I'm hoping that this is going to be, on one level, it's going to be a block, our last little block. And we've sort of promised last week that it was going to end on hopefully a philosophical note next week about time I think intensive quantities and philosophical issues that are crucial to the discussion of accelerationism. But the theme that's kind of carrying us coming out of this sort of stagnationist discussion that we've been having for 2 weeks is really side of that. And in terms of some of the skepticism that was raised by the people we were talking about in that frame, to talk about some of the trends that might lead us to kind of crystallize to some extent what the impending wave of techno-economic change, our next great wave, is going to look like. And I think as we saw, even extreme, you can be quite an extreme stagnationist, a pessimist, I'll say, as it generally is, while still accepting that however feeble, there's still going to be some perpetuation of this kind of wave-like dynamic of modernization or industrialization or whatever we want to call it. So I really want to do, in my little opening remarks, I really want to do two things. I want to say a very few little things about that, but mostly that's, I think, something to open up in discussion. And I also want to introduce a kind of modular topic that I want to slot in now, because I think otherwise it might just get lost. And I think it is very relevant to the basic course question about the concept of acceleration, which I call accelerationist trolley problems. But so to get to the first thing initially, I think the question is, coming out of the sort of wave theory stuff we've been looking at, how can we begin to envisage an infrastructure that is to the internet what the internet is to the telephone network? And very quickly this becomes beyond management. I think that even in all our combined efforts are only going to lead to certain sort of suggestive clues about this, because when you start simply just listing component technologies that all seem sort of viable candidates as something that is coming to maturity in this impending techno-economic wave, it's huge. I mean, just among, I suspect, a much longer list, there's, quantum computing seems to be about to kind of reach big time. Nanotechnology, which is a long-term thing, obviously has huge prospects. Computational genomics, or there are many other ways to describe this, but various kinds of biotechnology that are becoming inherently computational. Virtual reality finally seems to be about to take off, and I've had people make convincing cases that it could really be quite huge as a communication technology, and for all kinds of social social processes, not just as an entertainment medium, but for kind of replacing a lot of offline meetings with very high resolution online forums. Drone logistics is one I like. Obviously, blockchains is something that people, I think, very reasonably are talking about a lot. People expect intelligent agents of various kinds to just completely go nova very soon. I think rather than try and draw all these strands into some kind of convincing ensemble at this point, which I doubt my capability to do, I was going to quote something from Kevin Kelly, actually. Now, he's written this book called The Inevitable that I have to confess I haven't yet read, but it seems extremely relevant to this topic, and I've seen various discussions around it. There's a massive sort of set of links and resources associated with this book that I can just put in the sidebar. One of those pieces actually uses the word techonomics, which is something I like. But the first of these links is the one that I thought was good as just a kind of, for our purposes immediately. I'll post that separately, even though it's on that list. It's entitled, "The Internet is Still at the Beginning of Its Beginning." And he basically says, I won't read the whole of the first two paragraphs because it would take too long, but the first sentence is, can you imagine how awesome it would have been to be an ambitious entrepreneur back in 1985 at the dawn of the internet? You know, at that time, almost any .com name you desired was available. There's a funny little anecdote about someone realizing that the McDonald's hadn't claimed its URL, and so they took it themselves and tried to give it to the company, and McDonald's had no idea what they were trying to do or why they would be interested in accepting this gift, which I guess must have been worth many, many millions of dollars. Says, you know, having started with from 1985, 30 years later, the internet feels saturated with apps, platforms, devices, and more than enough content to demand our attention for the next million years. Even if you could manage to squeeze another tiny innovation, who would notice it among a miraculous abundance? But here is the thing. In terms of the internet, nothing has happened yet. The internet is still at the beginning of its beginning, becoming. If we could climb into a time machine, journey 30 years into the future, and from that vantage look back to today, we'd realize that most of the greatest products running the life systems in 2050 were not invented until after 2016. People in the future will look at their holodecks and wearable virtual reality contact lenses and downloadable avatars and AI interfaces and say, oh, you didn't really have the internet, or whatever they'll call it, back then. And they'd be right, because from our perspective now, the greatest online things in the first half of the century are all before us. All these miraculous inventions are waiting for that crazy, no one told me it was impossible, visionary start grabbing to now where with Tyler Cohen's thing, the low-hanging fruit, the equivalent of the .com names of 1984. So that seems to me a fairly obvious anti-stagnationist thesis that Kevin Kelly is making. I have to say I find it highly convincing. That doesn't mean that the kind of economic issues that we were talking about last week especially are simply dispelled, and it's possible for there to be a sort of massive self-propelling technological revolution in the internet while still involving massive cannibalization of value of the kind that we were looking at last week. It's obviously, he ducks the issue, I think, probably sensibly by saying, you know, calling it the internet or whatever they'll call it back then. I think if we're really envisaging a change as dramatic as he's suggesting, then it's very hard to imagine that there will not be a new name there. I mean, we don't call the internet the telephone network, and it seems to me that the change that we're talking about of a kind of AI saturated net is at least as profound as the change from sort of telecoms to packet switching network. But I think I'm going to just leave that as a set of question marks. I expect this is the thing that we're mostly going to talk about. And I think the sort of symptom of this a lot is there are a whole bunch of symptoms. I think one of them is the fact that there seems to be this kind of recatalyzation of accelerationism that we're seeing, and that this is a kind of, this course itself, I think, is a sub-symptom of that. I think this course is something that's kind of called into being by the fact that obviously there's this drag that's pulling accelerationist themes back into the public domain. I think it's no exaggeration to say. But another symptom is this very large discussion that is seen on all the challenging topics that come out of a phase transition in the history of automation. And this is huge. And here I'm sort of wandering, I think, almost automatically into another of the courses that I've done with some of you guys, which is this sort of anthropol material, and starting from the basic fact that industrialization in general and computerization in particular is driven by its techno-economic, by a process of substitution for human labor. And that produces this full, among other things, it produces a full threat spectrum that at one extreme has a whole bunch of questions. Last week we were talking about Luddism. I think these Luddism questions are hugely back, everyone. I don't think that's controversial to say. Lots and lots of discussion at the moment about the threat to employment that's coming from the sort of robot revolution that is already underway. And obviously at the far dramatic extreme of the threat spectrum, there are kind of whatever Skynet scenario type things, where the whole human species envisages itself as somehow being replaced or substituted in toto by these mechanical systems. And I raised that very, very briefly, just as a kind of a transition to this second little modular topic that I want to get to. That there's a whole part of the reason that accelerationism, I think, is important. It connects up to a whole series of ethical and political discussions that are driven by these kind of concerns. Obviously, from my point of view, like traditional concerns about capital on the one hand, and concerns specifically with a technological focus about these new machines are basically the same. So, I mean, I'll accept that that's a controversial thesis, but it's one I'm stuck with personally. And for some people, these get obviously very intense on either of these kind of interconnected dimensions. Everyone knows that the political discussion can get very intense, but also the kind of threat discussions in a narrow sense can get very intense. For people who think that the human species is existentially threatened by them, it would be surprising if they didn't become intense. And why I think that this is a particular concern for accelerationism is not just because accelerationism touches upon these same topics, although it obviously does absolutely centrally, but because I think that part of what is the concept of acceleration is something that implicitly reconstructs our sense of ethico-political dilemmas fundamentally. And that's because what is normally, if you look at if you look at the trolley problem as a kind of parodic, but I think still helpful kind of model of a kind of ethico-political dilemma, an attempt obviously to formalize it to a degree that can seem ridiculous, but at the same time is also in a certain sense. And it's hard to kind of dismiss out of hand what is going on there, or to say it's really not, that kind of modeling is not pertinent to the sort of decisions people are discussing when they're engaged in any kind of ethical or political conversation. What's missing from a trolley problem is the time factor. If I could actually at this point just quote a short paragraph from something I myself sent somebody. It's not appeared in the public domain now, but I might not be able to formulate this more clearly, and so I'm being lazy in doing this. But I say, in the context of acceleration and the problems it poses, for the purpose of illustration, it might be helpful to consider an accelerationist trolley problem, extracted from the idealist illusory form of a timeless dilemma. The stout, innocent stranger by one side is no longer to be weighed contemplatively against the lives of some half-dozen orphans who might be saved by his sacrifice. Rather, unless the fat guy dies right now, there won't be time to make a decision of any kind. We have scarcely begun to formulate the problem in these terms, whether philosophically or politically. It would be surprising, possibly even miraculous, if there was still time to do so. So what I'm trying to say with this issue is that the time factor goes missing in these discussions. Like it's a completely, there are people in the past who I think have raised it in a very interesting way. That perhaps the most striking example being Paul Virilio, who for whom this really was a central concern, and his deep skepticism and actually kind of spiritual terror of technology was precisely because he thought the sheer speed of accelerating technological processes, they would squeeze out the space of human decision making. And he gives examples of recent wars. He quotes an English in the Falklands War, who basically is expressing a kind of trauma at the fact that the sheer speed of the military process that he was confronted with was simply making decision making impossible. And it seems to me that obviously this has to be a part of any conversation that people are going to have about these threats, whether mundane or sublime, precisely because they are technological threats, and as part of that technological process one sees extreme quasi-consistent acceleration. It must be the case that the space of decision itself is under threat by these processes. That means that there is that there is a transcendental threat and not merely an empirical threat. The empirical threat is there's some very serious problem that requires attention. The transcendental problem is the possibility of attention itself is being technologically annihilated. And you know, one only has to sort of track these curves up to a certain point to see how this would become a completely inescapable, essential dimension of these problems. And therefore, it seems to me that this is the message that accelerationism has to inject into all of these discussions. Whatever else it might have to say, whatever else it might sort of think or contribute to these more kind of empirical dimensions of the issue, the transcendental contribution it makes is to say, do not think that you will have time vision process that you are envisaging. And this will obviously cascade down into much more concrete institutional questions about how rapidly decision making is possible within certain contexts, and whether the absolute urgency of decision making will itself drive certain kinds of political, perhaps psychological processes, and be a factor in the sort of reconstitution of the sort of political fabric, just not because people necessarily have any strong first order preference for certain type of arrangements, but that only certain kinds of arrangements are able to be rapidly adaptive enough to even be relevant to the problems that they're trying to tackle, and that certain perhaps far more attractive modes of human institutional organization would simply be too slow to address the kind of problems that they're envisaging. So yeah, I think that's me done with monologue phase. I'll try and catch up with sidebar material. My sidebar was truncated by my computer actually. Yeah. So Theo, I don't know. Do you want to kind of turn your question into something verbal?
I don't have much more to add to it. I'll just say it out loud for the recording. But it was why even call it decision at this point if there's no time to calculate consequence. And I see this tying into this whole question of people trying to resuscitate this notion of agency when
yes.
It seems to me that resuscitating agency doesn't grasp the scope of the problem, because you can resuscitate agency or acknowledge agency and still have competitive arm races. Or, as you're suggesting, the inability to think through the consequence. Yeah.
Yes, I think at a minimum that. I mean, I think the reason that I think the trolley problem is good, and why, is because it totally, it's a concrete illustration of decision, isn't it? Like decision, which is obviously something that I think everyone is at least accepting as a topic of discussion, whatever skepticism they might have about it, is the fact that there is more than one track things can go down, and that however one is conceiving agency, minimally, the trolley can be sent down two alternative tracks, and so you're weighing the consequences, you know, of it going down one track or the other track, introducing perhaps factors of like how much it will cost to divert it down one track or the other track, these kind of factors. And at the point we simply said, look, there's, you know, if decision was totally annihilated, there would simply only be one track. And even if people might want to end up there, it's not going to be that people will arrive there without controversy, but controversy takes time. And the notion that there is a kind of an atemporal space of decision that can precede the actual switch of the track or the other track is obviously something that I think accelerationism is compelled to call into question.
I mean, going back to Theo's point about why even call it a decision, from the perspective of political philosophy, I would say that it's basically, it's the purest kind of decision, what you're describing here. Look at, for example, Carl Schmitt's theory about dictatorship. The idea is that the state is often confronted by these conditions of absolute urgency in which it can't make decisions fast enough, and so it needs to appoint what Schmitt calls a commissarial dictator who can then make decisions as fast as possible. And I guess you could even link it up to Bataille's theory of sovereignty as being unknowing, that this is actually the purest form of decision-making is the one where you have to do it instantaneously without knowledge of what's going on almost. It's just something, it's an addendum, I guess, but interesting.
No, I don't think it is an addendum. I think it's like, I think there are various kind of threads to this, but one of the that is certainly at least as fundamental as any of the others, I think, is precisely the one that you're on. I think the Schmitt reference is extremely good, and the wider question is, does accelerationism what is the mode of linkage or engagement of accelerationism with some of the kind of heated the heated sense of political crisis that I think people can generally accept that we're immersed in at the moment, totally tied up with what you've just said, that the demand, the acceleration driven demand for certain types of extremely rapid response executive agency are kind of promoting political trends that people find deeply disturbing. Because I think it is obviously the case that if we take it from the other side, democracy is an extremely complicated, multifaceted term for sure, and there's lots of different things that could be emphasized in talking about it. But it seems to me that one of the things that is very, very deeply embedded in the notion of democracy is a certain kind of procedural languor, that to go through the proper democratic procedures, however they're conceived, to do with consultation and certain types of feedback, and a kind of processes is idealized as a kind of, on the one hand, educational and consultative, and then providing a kind of feedback of opinion through some mechanism from the public into the political process. All of this circuitry, this democratic circuitry, is time structured. And it seems to me extremely hard to imagine someone denying that the urgency of dilemma, of exactly the kind that you were just talking about, is not in some sense essentially anti-democratic in its implications. That some way or another, that kind of urgent demand for decisions cannot but short circuit democratic processes. And obviously that happens in the least sort of the way that happens that people are used to it, and therefore is in a sense perhaps the least horrifying to people is just the fact that through some kind of subsidiarity or whatever, that low-level agents, corporations, individuals are delegated the competence to make as much decision making as possible. Because if they were not, you know, the overall social process would just take too long. You know, there is that level of structural non-democracy just in having a decentralized, pluralistic, polycentric social order that you can say is already an expression of a certain kind of imperative to urgency in decision making. But there's, I think, in our contemporary world, a much more scary way that is coming to the fore, perhaps more associated with the kind of, you know, directly associated with the Schmittian question, which is just that, is it a threat? Is acceleration as a sort of historical process intrinsically threatening to democratic institutions? And it seems to me very probable that is true. Yeah, sorry.
I think it's worth it kind of articulating Schmidt's argument on this fully, because this is precisely the problem for him. Except for him, what you describe as Langer is actually, it's characteristic of what he calls liberalism rather than democracy. It's the kind of parliamentary procedure. It's people talking to each other. It's the Rechtsstaat, you know, the state of law, of rules and so on. But democracy, Schmidt argues, is actually something which is radically different to this. And in the age of mass politics, in which you get this kind of sense of urgency which you talk about, then the tendencies of democracy, which are anti-liberal, become more and more intense, because the final form of democracy for Schmidt is the plebiscite. It's people making instantaneous decisions, and the executive authority that can manage that best is not the parliamentary state. It's not something like America. It's the dictator. It's the sovereign dictator who can kind of represent the homogenous people in one point and make decisions which command popular approval. Because Schmidt draws this all the way back to, you know, the Germanic tribes. He says the king was acclaimed by the people. That's the pure form of democracy. It's a kind of irrational eruption constantly going on, which is very, very fast, and kind of exceeds the capacity of parliamentary decision making in the way that you talk about.
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
that's a very continental sense. You know, sorry. Yeah.
I was just going to say that there's a good. There's obviously a very good recent precedent with, because you had obviously Brexit, the sort of which was, I suppose, you know, your sort of instantaneous decision, popular decision, but then you had the sort of the times where it went up to the High Court, and then to the Supreme Court, and you had people trying, you know, rather transparently, and you can support them or you can oppose them, but trying to sort of use the machinery of the state, you know, the constitution, in the small c Dyson British sense, to try and sort of either thwart it or delay it or whatever else. I'm not sure. I mean, I think what Vincent's saying is right. I think we tend to, and there's a big tendency with just thought to associate democracy and to sort of categorize all sorts of things that we have alongside democracy, yeah, but that aren't necessarily democratic, or you know, and in that instance, you know, you could argue that they were sort of firmly, that machinery was set up firmly in opposition to a sort of an eruption of democratic will. I mean, it was just an aside. It was because it was just
no, but it is a really interesting, extremely complex and slightly sort of bedeviling question. There, actually. I mean, sorry, I won't go down to. I've been talking a lot anyway, but just very quickly on the usage of liberalism and democracy, because obviously, I think in the Anglophone context, the essential content of liberalism, as it is classically used, is delegation of decision making. I would have thought, you know, it's like it's the independence of low level actors in the social system that defines it as liberal. So it seems to me that this kind of Schmittian continental usage of it is very revealing, in the sense as it really says, it really explains why liberalism is not an ideological factor in Europe at all, or to negligible extent, in any sense that it would be understood in the English-speaking world. And whether one wants to then, you know, the defense one may or may not put towards proper parliamentary procedures and debates and all of this kind of thing, I think that all of that is highly tangential to liberalism in its Anglophone usage, in its traditional Anglophone usage. But maybe that's more controversial than I had expected it would be.
Well, of course, for Schmitt, liberalism is English, basically. He derives this story from the history of the English constitution. For him, the apex of liberalism is the 18th century English parliamentary state, in which you have these representatives who can talk to each other without depending on special constituencies. They represent the people in some sense, but basically they're trying to get at the truth in parliament. And for Schmitt, and I think he's probably correct in this, this picture was overwhelmed by the advent of mass politics when you get these people in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. David Lloyd George, who Max Weber calls the dictator of the electoral battlefield, people who very, very vehemently represent special interests. That, for Schmitt, is where liberalism stops and when democracy begins. And the contradiction between these two images, one of them the kind of 18th century style parliament and the other being the mass politics of the 20th century, that's the heart of the contradiction between liberalism and democracy for him.
Right. Yes. But I mean, I would only, sorry, I'm not going to just turn this into, this is too big a thing to be handled here, really. But, you know, it seems to me essential that in the Anglophone world, things like property rights within the liberal framework are simply not objects of legitimate political discussion. I mean, as soon as you move to a point where these kind of basic structures of agency and economic sovereignty, you know, down to an individual level, are matters of political debate, at that point one has left liberalism and entered the democratic age. So, you know, I'm just saying, you know, to define democracy as what is happening in Parliament seems already to me a kind of deeply questionable. Because there's a certain sense where the only thing that should be happening in Parliament from a strictly liberal point of view is the limitation of government agency as such.
Yeah, I mean, it goes into a big question over the meaning of the term liberalism, because liberalism is a very, very fuzzy term in intellectual history, and it basically emerges, I think, at the end of the 18th century, basically to describe aristocrats, that being liberal is being like an aristocrat in England. And then it kind of transforms in very interesting ways until basically the modern narrative of liberalism emerges in the Cold War retroactively to kind of summarize a whole bunch of things which people in the 19th century wouldn't have recognized as being liberal. There's a great article on this by someone at Cambridge, Duncan Bell, which I could link in the sidebar if people are interested in.
Sure, that would be good. Yeah.
I'm also wondering. Oh, sorry, someone else can talk.
I was just, where does the urgency come from? Because we talked earlier, like right at the start, about this concept of roundabout, like these technological leaps.
Hey Adam, I think your mic isn't working that well.
Is that any better?
Yes, that's good.
Yeah. So we talked about roundaboutness in economics and the path of technological improvement being this sort of process of investment and then rounding back in a way that is not a linear path, essentially, right? So it's sort of essentially slow at the beginning. So where does the urgency for the accelerationist trolley problem coming from? Because these most disruptive leaps are inherently sort of roundabout leaps in that same sense.
Yeah, no, this is a great question, I think. And it should have been, I think, a topic last week already, because I think, you know, what you're talking about partly there is about things, things being fluid, or almost in this Taoist sense, behaving like water. Like, you know, I think the great example of this that I find really helpful is a military one about how, you know, shocking everybody, the Germans broke trench warfare just before their collapse at the end of the First World War with these stormtroopers, and the way that these stormtroopers, their tactical doctrine then became the model for the sort of, you know, for everyone who was paying attention, who could do the same thing. I mean, the whole American military has just been obsessed with what was achieved there, which was, you know, to put it in a very, very crude nutshell, by delegating massive amounts of initiative down to NCOs, you know, and low-level officers. And they were told to, like, respond to circumstances as they found them and move forward in whatever way seemed optimum given local conditions. So the higher levels of the command system were just simply abnegating their command control responsibility over these guys, really, and saying, you know, we have to trust you, who know what the hell's going on at the ground, to make your own decisions locally in order to kind of advance optimally. And therefore the strategic effect is like water, you know, rather than having these rigid pre-programmed military maneuvers. You know, if people come to an obstacle, they move around it. They, you know, so roundaboutness is kind of involved in this thing. It's the fact that, you know, just to repeat, if you come to an obstacle, go around it. But the effect is obviously accelerative, in the sense that rather than getting stuck, rather than the whole thing being seized up by maybe the kind of, you know, the single greatest obstacle of the whole evolution is going to be the one that grinds everything to a halt, the people will find opportunities, they'll find cracks and fissures and ways of moving forward and be able to exploit local opportunities, and the whole overall the effect will be an acceleration. And it was devastatingly effective, you know, that these trench lines that everyone had thought were completely impregnable, suddenly these German attacks were just flowing through them and completely breaking out of the deadlock. So what I'm saying about that is that even though it looks like, you know, I totally think you're right to say, yes, look, isn't this kind of not going as the crow flies? Doesn't that look like something that's the opposite of acceleration? I think that is kind of an illusion. And that the whole point of roundaboutness really is that it's a process of optimization and therefore acceleration that appears that appears to be a retardation. And so I just say one more thing about this, and just take it back to its simplest example. And you've got your primitive hunters or whatever, and they're faced with this, question: do I go out and try and strangle a rabbit with my bare hands, or do I spend a day making some hunting instrument that will therefore improve my efficiency tomorrow when I go hunting? And if it normally takes 2 days to hunt a rabbit, but having sacrificed a whole day to make this tool, you immediately go and kill 2 rabbits on the second day, you've obviously very quickly accelerated your rabbit hunting process. You know what I mean? Even though you've done it through this roundabout production, and even though in the most straightforward sense of the time structure of the thing, you've actually just delayed the start of the actual hunting process by some significant amount of time. And I think that is the technological story in a nutshell. You introduce a kind of set of power looms and artificial mechanisms in order to do textile production. It obviously, there's a time lag implied in that because it's a roundabout process, but it so massively accelerates the production process that quickly it demonstrates itself to be accelerative. And I would say that this quickly is something that is probably itself historically sensitive, in that, the cycle that in which roundaboutness becomes, it immediately pays off, at least hypothetically, is itself something that is subject to an acceleration process.
So I just want to hop in here, because this question of like, do you make the tool that hunts more efficiently, or do you just go out and strangle the rabbit, immediately just brings us back to this question of decision again.
Yes.
Or doesn't it?
No, I think it does, for sure, yes. It's a model decision, the model economic decision. Yeah.
Right.
And also, on this topic, I'm not sure this is exactly what you mean, but why is decision necessarily a constant in this, or isn't decision making itself something that could be transformed in a way that is kind of difficult to conceive of right now, as a result of innovations in, computational genomics or quantum computing or something like that? I mean,
right.
Like what? Yeah.
Could people speed up their decision-making process? Is that?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, no, I think that's a crucial question, and it's tied up. Elon Musk has this whole thing about trying to kind of reconfigure our brains with this neural lace idea, which he says is necessary to keep up with AI. I think is extremely close to. But obviously the counter to this, or one of them, there's I think it's a crucial issue that has to be and will be raised in this framework. One of the responses is, well, is not that process of modifying the decision-making process not itself a process of dehumanization that's taking place? Is not everything, there's a certain humanistic response to say, is not everything being conceded at the point that you say we have to reconfigure our own most intimate ethico-cognitive processes in order to cope with the historical trend, which I'm sure could be deeply disturbing to certain commitments that people might have.
Sort of partially on this topic of speeding up the possibilities of decision making. I'm not sure where this goes empirically, but sort of from a transcendental perspective, I find it really interesting that there's sort of a spatialization of the temporal moment or instance of decision that's sort of like repeatedly happening here, particularly as soon as you consider like having to make a rapid decision or a decision that's faster than you're able to process. its ramifications, like, I mean, the military doctrine of, like, you know, local circumstances of the individual person in this sort of like locus or environment, like, that they are looking at the circumstances of, and then having to decide purely on that basis, as opposed to this sort of like presupposed field of consequences. Because like how we judge the consequences of things and like how we make this decision is, like, in a general way, has never been systematic. Like, it's never been something that we have an integral process of how we do it. Like, I mean, that's the whole thing with consequentialist philosophy and the decision problem. You can never really estimate, you know, the maximum utility for all people on Earth of a particular action. And I just sort of wonder if we're not getting to a point, like, especially with this takeoff in intelligent agents that everybody's expecting over the next few years, if we're not getting to a point where we develop like a generalized prosthetic faculty for decision making and estimation of consequences, like see a space in which you have this much space right now to decide or to preempt or to affect circumstance, and that space, the shape and volume of that space, is something that's constantly changing on the basis of information that, like, our, you know, native neural faculties are not able to process by themselves. But we now developed like this integration with, like, putting these information flows together in terms of a space of decision.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm like tempted, actually, Jake, here to kind of crudify what you're saying a lot, which is probably going to cut off what you think is all the most interesting parts of it, and just crop it back, first of all, to this question of locality that I think is really huge. Because obviously, like, you know, you can see just from these kind of Einsteinian issues almost, I think literally strictly Einsteinian issues, that the demand, the urgency of decision shatters space, doesn't it? It's like, take this obvious example of this HFT trading, where people are set up right next door to the stock exchange with these kind of laser beam communication structures. That means that, you know, given sort of light speed, they're within a tolerable temporal distance of the information that they're dealing on with, and they can make their decision effectively, that is, transmit it back to the stock exchange in a tolerable duration, and it's simply not possible for people to compete with them at all, to actually enter the arena of making those kind of economic decisions, if they're not actually strictly localized by the stock exchange and hooked up with kind of light speed photonic communication devices. So you know, there is obviously that level of, like, the space-time crossover that I think is just, like, totally strict like that, and has all kinds of political spin-offs, because it obviously means that insofar as the social totality is considered as something socially distributed, it is essentially cut out of these particular processes of decision. It will only learn about what has been decided, or its peripheries, or the, you know, if the peripheries define the wavelength of the social organism taken as a whole, they will only discover later, you know, belatedly, what has actually been decided.
Yeah, and I think the HFT, and I mean, James said this as well, I think the HFT thing is like a perfect and fascinating example, because, like, on the one hand, you know, you see this localization, this extremely strict localization that occurs, but what drives that localization is sort of the search for a continuum, right, between, like, to maximize, to arbitrage away, like, the tiniest differences in price between two exchanges. And so, like, physical localization is driven by a search process for abstract continuity, or, like, absolute consistency between different far-flung, like, locations or prices. in terms of, you know, those prices being matched, because arbitrage is always getting rid of those differences. And like similarly with locality and warfare, at the same time as you're seeing this like focus on the individual low-level commander's OODA loop and decision in response to local circumstance, the purpose of that is to create like continuity for the whole military organization's control of micro circumstance. And so you see all of this like, you know, networked soldier, like the squadron, you know, functioning as a single many-fingered hand kind of thing. And it seems like those constantly are going together, like the shattering into locality in order to create some sort of abstract continuity, which is again this sort of like abstract spatialization kind of thing.
Yeah. So by an abstract spatialization, I'm wondering what you think is the relation of that abstract space and like concrete physical space. And I'm by concrete physical space, I, you know, for these purposes, just defining it like in Einsteinian terms as that which, given the speed of light, necessitates a temporal delay that under certain technological circumstances becomes significant.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of, like, I think of frame drag, like frame of reference drag. Whenever you experience, like, when you're acceleration, gravity, something like that, the two frames of reference, like the one that's static and the one that's accelerating away, are getting dragged apart, like the in terms of like latency in their clocks or the difference in their clock time that they show. And so if we see like these points of acceleration where like sudden low-level conflict breaks out or something like that as a kind of like frame drag, then it's sort of like, it's the problem of standardizing clocks across like many accelerating frames of reference that might be accelerating in different directions or different ways with respect to each other, and are trying to solve this like Poincaré problem that you pointed out of like standardizing your clocks at these great distances without a relativistic level. And it's, yeah, it's it reminds me just loosely of like one of my favorite problems that I ever got, like, you know, learning physics early on, which is who hears the ball hit the bat first at a baseball game, the viewer 500 miles away on the TV or the person sitting in like the first row in the stands. And it turns out that like pretty much anywhere in the TV network, it's the TV viewer. It's you in your living room 1,000 miles away who hears it before the person 500 away in the stands.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, very germane.
I mean, do you see like this sort of like, that is kind of what you're going for in terms of the relativistic thinking issue, like these different frames of reference?
I don't know. I mean, this last example is obviously tantalizing in the sense that you can say that it's a kind of there's an arbitrage opportunity between the speed of sound and the speed of light, and that you could sort of transpose that into a political framework and say, you know, for a certain moment that you have some sort of verbal political procedure in a centralized political organ that was then being been swallowed into a kind of a electromagnetic mediascape, and exactly the kind of process that you've just referred to would mean that for just an instant in sort of socio-political time, there's this opportunity to massively expand the scope of like democratic simultaneity. You know, that the speed of verbal exchange within the concentrated political body is suddenly actually comparable to that of the entire distributed social body because of this, because, you know, one's happening at the speed of sound and the other's happening at the speed of light. But it seems to me that that is a very peculiar moment, and, you know, to whatever extent it was enjoyed, I mean, perhaps it was enjoyed, but, you know, perhaps there was a certain moment of democratic efflorescence that reflected that, you know, and, you know, the difference between a time, you know, at which you would hear about decisions that have been made in your political organs by people traveling on horseback, you know, and therefore the kind of geopolitical fragmentation that was inherent in that was neutralized momentarily. But I think the thing is that when everything is moved on to the electromagnetic spectrum, then you lose that difference. So, you know, nothing is happening live. You know, no one cares about anything that's happening live. It's irrelevant. Everything is happening in cyberspace, and cyberspace is fragmented by these relativistic considerations. You know, at a certain, I mean, you know, I do think when we get back to the HFT thing, it's the most crucial example that we can see this kind of absolutely radical return of locality, and the fact that you just can't afford the relativistic time lag that would be involved in a distributed commercium, in a certain respect. Like there's this John Smart guy's got a really interesting thing where he says, look, eventually artificial intelligence has to try and collapse everything into black holes, because if you're not actually crushed in a black hole, the relativistic disturbance of integrated thought becomes too great to be tolerable. And so even what we would consider negligible spatial distances become these forms of, at certain intensities of intelligence, become these massive impediments to cognitive integrity that are completely intolerable. And I think we are seeing the germ of that in this particular case.
Yeah, definitely, because I mean, what counts as negligible space is standardized against a certain rate. You know, I mean, a negligible space like becomes non-negligible to the point that you accelerate so much that the time difference, you know, that is caused by that spatial interval is significantly different in terms of your basically your computational cycles per second.
Exactly.
Yeah, it wasn't. Oh, yeah. The democracy thing is really interesting because you could kind of see. I think you could see that the mass audience advertising based televisual politics that starts arguably with JFK and then kind of reaches its ascendancy with the last couple electoral cycles as arbitraging this incomplete cybernetization of democratic decision making. So that really what is getting piped out instantaneously rather than with a horse to everybody? Well, it's the king's speech, that everybody is now seeing. But decision, individual political preferences about this or that policy are only spreading by, comment thread, chat room, word of mouth, in the same ways more or less that they always have. And it's that difference that's being exploited. But with e-voting, what I think of as demarchy. I don't know if here in the real world, demarchy means a mass e-voting system where everybody votes on every policy they want to. But obviously, I'm thinking of Revelation Space and the demarchy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Which the problem with that, or the problem posed to that, has always been it's the attention costs are too high. So how is everybody actually going to vote on all of these things all the time, even if they have access to the ability to do so? Which again, brings back this intelligent agent, your smart assistant who can effectively model what you would want to, vote for out of these policies, and then does it for you, and only pings you, for an actual decision if it's highly novel. If the model says I'm not sure enough what the citizen would actually want to decide.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a sort of a orthogonal issue, which I totally agree is there for sure. But I mean, there's also I think the localization problem is additive to that. Even if through some weird form of AI supplementation, one had effectively infinite attention capacity, it would still be the case that in generalizing a political process across space, you would be putting a certain durational structure on it that might be completely inadequate to an urgent problem. So, I mean, if there was a general trend to the increasing urgency of problems, it would tend necessarily to drain out political authority from widely spatially dispersed political entities, whether in even more in orbit, I guess, than we're seeing.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like there's just this huge bifurcation, and in one direction, it's towards the rapid response team as like the paradigm of executive agency, and on the other hand, maximally fragmented, political micro decision on the other, and it's like who or what decides the split. Like that maybe is like one of the ultimate mass political questions here is like, where do you have this junction between the demos and the rapid response team, or the emergency management infrastructure?
Yes. I mean, I think Vincent's totally right to say this is it does connect very much with these Schmittian problems. But yeah, sorry, Adam. Yeah.
I was just going to say the example of infantry tactics, which you brought in before. I was trying to look for a good quote on it, but I couldn't find it. But U.S. Marine doctrine based on the same stuff. Like in the absence of other orders, Marine units they follow a basic sort of hill climbing strategy. First is literally find higher ground, and the second is establish comms. So the second is get back in touch with the larger group so you can share information and be part of this larger organism that is able to take advantage of centralized information from the whole battlefield and not just your localized sort of space. So like this trade-off or this constant aspect of communication back to the center and the re-centralization of information still seems critical.
Yeah, it's relevant for sure. So even as a decentralized entity, it's a kind of sense organ as well as an executive organ. But yeah, sorry, John. Yeah,
I wanted to share a little story along these lines. So in the Landa's book, War in the Age of Intelligent Machines, because he's very interested in lowering decision-making thresholds in this book. And he tells the story of the sort of Americans, grease monkeys, who were able to work on their tanks and their jeeps, spontaneously in the field and get them re-operational just by this kind of know-how that they brought in to the army, versus the sort of like if a German tank broke down, they had to sort of send an order into the German high command, send out an engineer. It took days and days, and he talks about this as one of the reasons why the Americans won the war. But I was thinking, then alongside of this, imagining sort of like Alan Turing working in, alone or with a team of 7 people in Britain, sort of fighting the same war at a different level, and the kind of dialectics of this matter that we're talking about. There's a narrative where Turing could say, "I won the war," right? Or the Landa on the level of the field, the local decision making could say, "Well, the grease monkeys won the war." Or, I don't know where this all adds up, but there's something there, I think.
Yes. There's an anecdote in the Turing movie. I think it was there, which I thought was really germane to this, which is obviously this huge paradox of intelligence that they found. They broke the Enigma codes and they got this German signal. I think it's about bombing Coventry, actually, wasn't it? And so they took this to the government and said, we found out this information is going to be that they're going to be a massive bombing raid on Coventry. And the government response, and I think it was actually mediated by one of the best characters, is this very, very cold sort of intelligence expert, says that we can't do anything about it. Because if we take any kind of make any kind of response to this information, we are demonstrating that we've broken the code, and so we're sacrificing our whole position of sort of informational leverage in order to just for this one-off tactical benefit of saving people from being incinerated by this bombing rate. And I think the point of relevance to this is the fact that that decision is obviously being made super locally, isn't it? So your grease monkey in the field is not being, they're not in the loop at all about the fact that this collective social decision has been made to let a town be bombed to pieces in the interests of the greater good. And the reason for that is not exactly the same as the reasons, it is perhaps connected, but it's not exactly the same as the reasons we've been discussing. But it's still, I think, very related to the point that you're making. Like this thing, well, you could say who won the war, but there's also this kind of democratic question, isn't there, about who's involved in a war, who's sharing in the decisions that are being made in a war, you know. So for sure your grease monkey gets to decide to just do whatever they want to the engine of their tank without anyone interfering with that. But at the same time, they're completely excluded from these questions of strategic significance.
Yeah.
That seems like a great example of sort of like roundaboutness of preemption that Adam was talking about, like the Coventry bombing. That is, like, you're giving up a certain amount of prerogative in the present in order to maintain, like, longer term, a higher level of prerogative in the future. Like, that's just like the perfect example of decisional roundaboutness.
Right. Yeah.
Or like the movie, you know, which is highly dramatic and everything in this regard. Just the construction of the Turing machine itself as a process of roundaboutness. There was sort of all these attempts to shut it down, and it's taking too long, and you're not producing results, and right?
Yes, totally. Yeah. No, and I mean, I'm pretty confident that any technological process is going to give you that sort of narrative. You know, the drama of technology is precisely that, isn't it? You know, exactly as you say, in this case, it's taking ages. There's a lot of resources. When are we ever going to see this? It's, you know, there's an opportunity cost every day that you're devoting resources to this thing that isn't yet working. But obviously, the dramatic turnaround is the fact that the advantages that you get once it does start working so overwhelm the costs that it makes a mockery of those previous chronological and economic calculations.
The intersection of military decision-making and democracy reminds me of a infamous quote from Max Weber, which I just wanted to throw out there. He said this to General von Ludendorff, who was one of the generals who led Germany during World War I. Explaining democracy, Weber said, in democracy, the people elect a leader in whom they have confidence, and then the elected leader says, shut up and obey. People may no longer meddle in what he does. Afterwards, they can sit in judgment, and if he has made mistakes, to the gallows with him.
Right.
I don't know.
No, but that, you see, I'm taking that as implicit in what you're saying about the Schmittian relation of democracy to speed. You know, even if you ignore the time lag factors that are involved in the plebiscite and arranging it and the informational collation and all of that, let's just say that that's relatively compressed, at least within a certain kind of ambit. But it can only act as a kind of rapid response mode if executive discretion is then given an absolute free rein, can't it? Like there has to be a total surrender of democratic control that goes with the democratic decision. Like in making a democratic choice, you're saying, and with this choice, you know, there's an irrevocable commitment and an abandonment of all claim the control over the evolution of this process. Because if there isn't if that isn't implicit, then obviously you're not in any way producing the capacity for this rapid executive decision-making process. I don't know if I silence everyone. It's ominously as if my machine isn't working. So
No, you're fine. You're fine.
okay, good. Yeah.
I think Theo's question there is really relevant and interesting. Like, are the ends of foregoing prerogative now, of preemption, of whatever it is, are they explicitly clear? And it seems like inevitably the answer has to be no, or at least the fraction of the answer that is no is sort of like what's at stake. It's that it's always open-ended. You don't know what decisions you're going to be pressed to make instantaneously, or you're going to need this prerogative for in the future. Like, when they allowed the Coventry bombing to go through, it wasn't because they knew that in 8 months they were going to want to stop this U-boat, hitting this shipping route through the North Atlantic. That just ended up being the case, but they knew that at the moment they couldn't do anything about the bombing and still maintain the ability to do any of those end things in the future. And like sort of modeling what those end things are, and so like what you're purchasing essentially by foregoing prerogative in the moment
is obscure,
right? And integrally so. Yes, I don't know, Theo, if you had anything else.
Yeah, well, I mean, the military strategy examples are really interesting because the objective is very, very clear. I'm wanting to pull that into like a more abstract territory, I suppose, where the objectives are not clear, and decisions need to be made, or at least we're forced into tracks.
Well, they are clear in a capitalist, or I suppose right accelerationist setting, aren't they? Because it's survival, I suppose, is the key thing. Because you've got the two paths. You can't really apply your what was it, catching a rabbit or building a spear? But there are decisions. There's the, I suppose, the short-term gain, or the other option to sort of, maybe it's invest in research and development or something like that. And in hindsight, you'll see, looking back, Firm X, sure, they did well over the short term, but they didn't invest in research and development, and a few years later they fell behind and died. Whereas and there's the contrary one, I suppose, where a firm that sort of never actually delivers, a bit like one of those internet companies that never ever turns a profit ever.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that's I suppose why the sort of, if capitalism is your structure or your measure, it's very easy to measure things and to see, especially in hindsight, what success means. But if you try and transpose it to a left accelerationist, and you look at decision making and things, it's well, how do you ever judge whether you've been successful? Because it seems to me that so much of the left accelerationist critique of capitalism, it's this, it's this really sort of hypothetical. It's well, yeah, sure, there's been a certain amount of success, but you're actually being held back by this. We can't really show you why, and it's well, I'm not expressing it very well, but it's the metrics aren't clear, the way the aims aren't clear, the end goals aren't clear, At least, well, and if someone could correct me, that would be fantastic. I'd be very interested to hear it. But it seems so much simpler to quantify things, and to judge things, and to measure things. You know, within that, where it's basically profit and loss, and failing and succeeding.
I mean, I don't think we've got anyone here. Well, maybe our Anon guys are able to.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
I would have thought they're by far our most plausible candidates as for the voices of left accelerationism. Can I just say as a preliminary thing, I do think it has to be a really complicated question. But the term that must be part of the answer, surely, for them is this thing they have about collective self-mastery. So there's some implicit thing about the construction of a collective subject that no doubt would still have some of these problems of criteriology, but would, you know, in some sense, you know, provide the basis for deciding which was the preferable track to go down in these, you know, set of decisions. But it's complicated with them because they have this big polemic against horizontality, and as soon as you have this kind of, you know, this vertical command control system that's at least partially valorized, I'm assuming, maybe at least implicitly, for some of the reasons we've been talking about, for kind of its executive rapidity and responsiveness, then I think your problems then become even more acute, because it's like you're just trusting that particular command control function to make the right call, and it's not even that there's some kind of tight collective feedback system that's holding it in check or providing some criterion for it. But anyway, sorry, I shouldn't try to argue for it, because I'm obviously not a major left accelerationist advocate.
Well, isn't one of the arguments of Cernicek and Williams that actually a kind of planned economy in the Cybersyn sense could be more efficient quantitatively than a liberal capitalist economy?
I mean, I'd say so. Aren't they arguing basically that right at this moment?
Sorry, your audio is again.
Wait, can you say it again? You're going in and out.
Aren't they arguing that basically right now we're just catching rabbits with our bare hands, and we need to go build a sphere? We need to make a large executive decision to take a roundabout route to build a sphere. I'd say that's what they're arguing.
But doesn't that get into trouble with this whole polemic that they have against purely quantitative, you know, brain dead speed, all these kind of arguments that they have against the purely quantitative criterion, which they're attributing to capitalism, it seems, in a lot of their rhetoric. So now to now say, well, we're going to actually keep that criteria, and then it's just that in those purely brain dead quantitative terms we can outperform capitalism, seems to me a bit of a kind of rhetorical train crash there. I don't know.
Do they specifically? Sorry.
It's just one of those spaces where they leave it undefined, or underdefined, essentially, and there couldn't be many interesting answers to that, which they sort of sidestep, or they suggest there could be quantitative criteria which are not capitalist criteria, but they don't sort of pick some. They just suggest some. I'd say, which maybe, you know, makes sense as a call to action, but you'd sort of want to follow up, I guess.
I don't know if this is right, and other people might have some sense of this, but my sense is that with Williams and Sneernesek specifically, rather than like the broader left accelerationist project, that they've had some significant reflexing since the publication of their book and the manifesto, because of their debates with the left. And in a sense, my sense is, and I can only state it broadly, that they're kind of sacrificing their accelerationism for leftism, if that makes sense.
Right. That does seem.
I went to a debate with them with Badu in New York sometime after the election, and they absorbed, his critique. Meaning they didn't challenge him at all. They didn't argue for their position in the least.
Right.
They accepted the critiques. All the critiques there are from the left about that book, they seem to be absorbing them into their new work. I could be wrong, but seems to me, Sneernesek seems to me to be more and more of a kind of Marxist in a more classical sense these days.
So, but how would you, this is a lot to ask, so please feel free to just duck it entirely. But in terms of what you just said, which does seem to me to be very plausible, how do you think it actually relates to this question about what are the criteria for performance once you subtract the criteria of business success and these kind of capitalistic metrics for success, stock market valuations, and all of this kind of thing? If those are being removed, what are you now using as your metric to just decide whether or not something is succeeding or failing?
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm suggesting. I think that they're moving more towards this, for example, in Badu's case, right? What does he want? It's the communist hypothesis, the communist idea. It's an appeal to a kind of transcendent value or something. I think that they're moving more towards something, I don't know, like that. Perhaps they're entering that side of the conversation more, rather than because of this question that you're posing. It's hard to answer, and there has to be a certain decision to be made at a certain point, perhaps between when you have left and accelerationism. When you add the left to it, are you more of an accelerationist or are you more of a leftist? Because they're not necessarily compatible. Perhaps.
Right.
I don't know.
Yes. It does seem that their decisions of the kind that you've been saying do suggest that, at least from their point of view, incompatibility struck. So, people might not agree with them about that, but they seem to at least be suggesting that, don't they? And that some decision was forced upon them. They think between the attractions of those two terms.
Yeah, we'll see.
Because it's something I'm struck by, that I see a lot of left accelerationist people who I follow on social media. They often share these articles arguing that capitalism is actually technically inefficient compared to planned economies. I know there's one article which was written in the 90s suggesting that actually the Soviet Union had similar technical efficiency to the United States on a purely technical kind of quantitative basis. And so I'm wondering how that argument can figure into this.
Yeah. There's a very interesting Austrian riposte to that type of thinking. I don't know the specific argument the specific paper you're referring to, I'm afraid, but
I'll look it up.
I'm trying to think whether it was Mises or someone subsequently. I think the germs of this is already in the calculation problem in the Socialist Commonwealth piece, which is that it's a very different thing to try to do this criteriology when you're in a world that is not wholly socialist. You know, if you have neighboring capitalist states putting prices on various economic outputs and services, then you can simply borrow that information in order to establish metrics for your own socialist process. So, I mean, that's not in itself an argument to say that within those limited terms the socialist process can work. That's a separate argument. But it is to say that the criteriology is totally parasitic. You know, that there's no endogenous process within the socialist society that is providing this price information about the value of its outputs. And it would simply not know, you know, if it's sacrificing a certain amount of iron production for school teachers, for medical assistance, for military capability, whatever trade-offs it's making, without that external foreign price system to draw upon, it would simply not know whether it was moving forwards, backwards, sideways, or whatever. It would be utterly incapable of that kind of a judgment.
I mean, I sort of take them as meaning, like say in the example of something like energy, that that the fossil fuel industry has an interest in suppressing progress towards really efficient and cheap solar power or something like that. And that if we could, in some planned way, focus massive resources towards that, it would be some kind of real game changer for human society. And that what's holding it back is this existing infrastructure for fossil fuels. That it's not actually the most efficient thing because it's, it's serving these interests that already exist. Like when I read those passages in the MAP, that's kind of the kind of thing that I imagine them having in mind, but I'm not sure if it is.
Right.
And maybe there's something similar for like nutrition and the agriculture industry, like we could, or medicine, whatever.
Yes, I mean, I think that the comparison I was making to forcing functions in Musk is very right. I mean, but it still to me leaves the problem, like, in the absence of some reference to a market pricing system, how would you, or that's to say a system of price discovery in general, how would you at all know whether you were succeeding or failing in the production of this new network? It has a whole bunch of social inputs. It requires a certain amount of trained engineers, various kinds of equipment, a massively complicated set of economic inputs, and it's outputting whatever. I guess in the end you can probably just make it all into fungible electricity, but you've got no way to judge what the value of those inputs it's absorbing are at all. You just have this impressionistic sense of whether or not this is something that is being successful, and the more you try to rigorize that intuition, the more you realize that you just lack any basis for solid information about it.
it's also the question of you know, that goal, the solar power goal, is what, you know, what's being done is you're looking at a sort of capitalist framework, and you're pointing out a deficiency from a certain point of view, something that isn't being done adequately. But like, how do you, if you were to assume that, you know, the capitalist economy is to be superseded by something else, how do its future goals become set? You know, according to what? I mean, you know, at the moment, sure, we say, oh, you know, I would like more solar power, and the various other things, you know, a bit like they say in the MAP, you know, we want to work less, you know, things like that. It's like what you're doing, you're criticizing something that currently exists. Where is the sort of the independent set of objectives and values, and, you know, once you've replaced the currently existing system with something else, where is the forward direction from there? I mean, what is it propelling itself towards?
Yes.
And you know, all the other questions, like who and come into.
Yeah.
This is something that I think we were talking about in early weeks. I mean, the question is that, you know, capital as an abstract system, I mean, does it require capitalists? Do we need to speak of capitalists? Do we need to talk of values or endorsing or anything? I mean, the impasse for the left or left accelerationism precisely is that it's not that there are these, you know, capitalists with their values, so to speak, who are winning a war. I mean, capital is I don't know, it's just we live in capital. I don't know. It's,
yeah. I mean, look, I don't know whether I'm on the right track with what you're raising here, John, but like at the most abstract level, the only thing capital does or can value is the expansion of productive capability. So, you know, all its circuitry, everything, it just that's the one fundamental imperative. And so it fulfills consumer demands, and it accepts government regulation, and all its behavior is finally regulated, you could say almost libidinally, by the fact that it just seeks simply to expand itself as a stock of productive capability. Now, obviously, that doesn't involve anything recognizable as kind of specifically humane bourgeois imperatives or even class interests or anything like that. And I would have thought there's a tradition on the left to say, yeah, if you capture it in its most abstract form, you capture its monstrosity most clearly, you know, and that the left, it's not really, it's only by proxy kind of at war with the bourgeoisie or at war with a particular business class. You know, what it's at war with is the capital imperative as the sole source of value that is really being generated in modern societies. But then that does take us back. If I mean, you know, obviously people could reject that and say, you know, maybe reject 180 degrees and say, no, we can, you know, if we can really strip capital down to that pure machine function, then we can somehow repurpose it or integrate it into some other kind of social arrangement. I'd like to see that done, but I guess it's imaginable. But oh, sorry, I'm losing my own chain of thought there. What I'm really trying to say is that if you do accept that this just abstract capital dynamic is actually the problem of capital that is being addressed by the left, then that does then return this problem about, well, what is the source of value? What's the substitute for source of values that is being introduced? You know, capital gives you this gives you this value system automatically, you know, and the whole price system then is articulated through this basic imperatives of capital expansion. If you're stripping that out, then you have to have some other system for coordinated production of social values, I'm assuming.
Sure, but I mean, I think that the other question is if we accept this distillation of capital in its abstract dimension, then becomes a philosophical question of agency and subjectivity, meaning that, like, in a sense, I don't think that this sort of that the class struggle is preeminent. I think it's sort of a secondary effect and a necessary dimension to discuss, but that in a sense, for the left to sort of win, the impasse that it faces is precisely that history is running in the wrong direction, and that the right, whatever, doesn't have to do anything. If you accept capital as almost an ontological force, even if it's not trans-historical in a certain conception, that it can be, you know, contingently and historically situated, nonetheless, this is where we live now. So that's the question. That's where it becomes philosophical in a sense, you know, what place is there for agency?
Yeah.
And this leads into what Nick labeled transcendental miserablism, right?
I don't know the label. Transcendental miserablism?
Nick can probably explain it better than I can.
Well, it's a long time since I've been there, actually, and I'm not sure. Yeah, I'd be interested to see how you see it articulating. I mean, but that was part of purely a kind of a polemical moment about a certain trend to a kind of simultaneous transcendental inflation of capitalism and negation, you know. So it was just it seemed to me there was a kind of a syndrome of saying everything. I mean, you know, people like the situationists, I think, get really close to this. You know, everything is saturated with capitalism, and that is this Manichaean disaster. You know, this is this fallenness, this Gnostic horror. You know, so it simultaneously blocks out, fills the whole horizon beyond any imaginable practical negativity, and then throws the whole of reality into this pessimistic denial. So that was transcendental miserablism. I'm not sure exactly what Vincent's saying the connection is, though, to John's point.
If you see capitalism as this ontological force, and that basically history moves by its wrong side, then
Right.
the logical response is to oppose the progress of history, which is what I take transcendental miserablism basically
Okay.
to
So
mean.
it's this Gnostic pessimistic impulse that you think is a
Yeah.
dangerous trap.
Right. So, like, I think I posted a couple articles by Postone to Moishe Postone. I don't know if people know his work to the forum. And I mean, I think in a sense, he would accept the accelerationist proposition, but would not render it transhistorical. Precisely, it's not ontological. He would, you know, that would be a way. It doesn't answer how we get out, but it nonetheless posits that the potential for an out.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yes. No. I know Jehu is like a huge Postone fan, so I'm afraid I'm not very versed in his thing. I've only looked at a few bits and pieces, but I take a recommendation by Jehu very seriously. So I must, if you're redoubling that recommendation, and I must definitely look at it. Yeah. Are we gonna? There's a sort of suggestion that Afro-pessimism answers the question of the subject. So I'd like. Oh yeah, we've got a link. Great. I'll add that to the reading list too.
I don't mean to change the subject necessarily, but
Oh yeah, that's fine.
silent. Well, I just was actually interested in hearing you, Nick, say more about the first topic that you brought up, sort of specific ideas about what technological changes are likely to take place in the future.
Well, I mean, maybe this is actually a really good thing to throw open a little bit, actually, because yeah, I definitely expected us to be there a lot. I mean, it's a bit overwhelming, isn't it? There's the question, and it's one of those points that, like, obviously, if you really had confident insight on this question and couldn't convert it into a multi-billion-dollar fortune, then you're some kind of idiot, you know. So there's that whole "if you're so smart, why aren't you rich" kind of rider that goes with it, and should induce some humility, I think, on the speculative side of it. So I guess the thing is partly like, to what extent do we agree that there is an impending substantially novel techno-economic infrastructure on the way? You know, like, obviously that's what the wave theorists would predict. It seems to me almost a kind of stronger speculative claim to suggest that there isn't one. That would be a kind of form of like radical stagnationism, I think, probably exceeding that of any of the people we've seen. Maybe the Gordon piece got close to something like that. But I think if you aren't tempted by that kind of extreme techno-pessimism, then you're almost by default, there's a placeholder for this new matrix, this new infrastructure. And I think it has to be more than just a kind of suite of compatible technologies, you know. Like, even when you have a whole interesting suite of compatible technologies, it's like the defining character of the economic epoch is an infrastructure. You know, I don't think anyone says, you know, doubts that this is the age of the internet, and before that it's like, you know, at various stages, you know, the telecommunications grid, the electrical grid, the railway network. These fundamental infrastructural upheavals are the thing that actually give the economic epoch its fabric. So, I mean, I'll only say one thing on the speculative side before just like maybe trying to solicit stuff from people about it, which is just to say, it surely has to be that intelligent agents are key to this new grid in some way. You know, it is to intelligent agents what the internet is to information exchange, what the electrical system is to power exchange. And that the fundamental innovations are going to be of that kind, that it supports intelligent agents as basic components, artificial intelligent agents. This is obviously you know, also Kevin Kelly's thesis. He actually says artificial intelligence is going to be the electricity of the next grid. cognification of everything is going to, just like electrification of all technology was being rolled out by the electrical epoch, and the informatization of all objects is, goes with the first stage of computerization. Then this cognification of the world is going to be the thing that we see, that everything around us is saturated increasingly with artificial intelligence. That seems to me highly plausible as a basic, very crude schema for it.
It's also, as a side note, interesting. Side note to that, interesting that there's sort of like a way that like a late development in electrification is sort of entangled with making that possible, which is like, I posted these links at like the very last second, so probably nobody's seen them, but like battery technology, energy storage, has not seen like a 0 to 1 non-incremental jump in about a half century. But like there's several groups sort of like recently very successfully pursuing avenues to doing that. And like the most promising, Sakti 3, is talking about a 2 order of magnitude jump in storage density, like 300 times the
wow. That is amazing.
Just an extraordinary. And that's what a smart grid, like an electrical smart grid, needs to be able to, do the whole renewable thing where you've got fluctuating levels of input from all of these small sources. It needs to be able to store and release in a much more like fine-grained, intelligent sort of way. And I mean, there's 100 other things that battery technology like that would do that to. And so if like the smart grid is sort of the first big way that this intelligent Internet of Things, like mediation of physical quantities by artificial intelligence takes off, like, electrification will have reached around the back to give it a jump start.
Right. Yeah, that would be stunning. I mean, obviously, I don't want to. Maybe I shouldn't take everything too far down the battery line, but just as a redistribution of power issue, power in its political as much as its kind of energetic sense, that type of transformation of battery technology would be unbelievable. I mean, the electric grid would just become a kind of a facility for juicing up your batteries, and the amount of kind of autonomization that it would offer to localized processes of all kinds would be immense. Yeah, so I think it would have extraordinary implications if that was to come around.
The electro grease monkey or electro nomad.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, electro nomadism. Yeah. I mean, it is interesting. I almost feel guilty about trying to press people about these things, because there's literally no difference between asking people now what are their speculative philosophical techno bets and asking them for stock tips, isn't it? I mean, it's exactly the same question. It's like trying to garner for free kind of completely economically valuable information off people here, a form of just absolute predation. So that's like, I find that slightly inhibiting. But having said that, obviously, if people do have these long range stock tips that they want to share, that this is the moment for them.
I feel like, I mean, we're talking about what comes after the internet age. To me, and I've written about this before, it seems like we're only just now beginning to enter the internet age in the proper sense. It's only now that we're starting to see the internet overwhelming politics and what's to me this very interesting phenomenon, what looks like the emergence of a kind of subjectivity proper to the internet itself, rather than just being the kind of the use of the internet by exterior political forces, which I think to some extent the rise of Trump had something to do with that in 2016, and other phenomena happening now. In China even, you can see the increasing effect that discussions on the internet are having on policy.
Yeah.
So I think we still have a long way to go, and in my opinion, and I think we still need to kind of grapple with the full implications of the internet age. It hasn't really been done yet, I think.
Yes. No, I think that's definitely good corrective to a certain way of spinning it, because I totally agree with that. Like the industries that just what we already know about the internet are clearly in the crosshairs for just massive creative destruction, just is a huge swathe of the current social order, isn't it? I mean, you know, the financial industry, the academy, the publishing industry, all of these things, these structures are massively threatened by what the internet already clearly shows it can do. So that's yes, I would agree with you, of course.
Along these lines of Vincent's point, I don't know if anyone works in advertising or has, you know, friends who work in advertising, but I think the advertising that is now properly entering into the internet age has laid this dichotomy bare, because, you know, advertising before the age of the internet proper was sort of this, you know, Edward Bernaysian inheritance of Freud PR thing, where you sort of, you know, appealing to the populace's base interests and their drives, and there's the, you know, smart ad writers trying to figure out how to get into the consumer's unconscious or something would be a representation of it. And now it's sort of like they sell themselves in a sense, you know, like they're really excited by the product too, and it's not a trick on sort of the populace, but this kind of, I think it's a byproduct of this internet subjectivity, that there's something new that we're witnessing, in which the you know, it was kind of what I was saying before in the sense of capital. Like, I wouldn't say that these people who work in advertising are sort of sinister capitalists, so to speak, or Silicon Valley or whatever. They're kind of sell themselves now. I'm struggling to articulate what I mean, but there is this kind of new form of subjectivity.
Right. Yeah. No, it is very interesting. I mean, it's partly peculiar because so much of the internet has been funded by advertising, and I guess continues to be. You know, it's sort of, this again is back to last week's whole discussion about the peculiar, perverse economics of the internet. So in a certain sense, advertising increasingly takes on the credibility of the internet, or the cultural credibility of the internet sort of transfers to the advertising industry in a certain way automatically. Because these are the people who actually, in the economic sense, are allowing this thing to go forward, aren't they? So for sure, they might be selling fizzy drinks or whatever else, but what they're also selling is this particular internet-based social process, and that so for getting on board with the advertising process is getting on board with the promulgation of internet as well.
Yeah, so like I see someone put Pepsi in the sidebar, like that Pepsi ad would be a perfect example of this antiquated form of advertising that I'm talking about. That's why it didn't work.
But there is still an interesting version of that, or I don't know if it is a version, you know, there's some sort of update of it, which is like these endlessly long Apple ads. And like I think other people started doing it as well, where it's just like literally like a montage of beautiful and cute things, like, oh, like kids blowing out candles, a mountain, like, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's like, that was it, you know, like, and then
yeah, that's sort of sad. Yeah. I think actually, weirdly, I seem to, without completely unconsciously, without any strategy, have cut masses of advertising out of my life. Like, I mean, for instance, embarrassingly, I haven't seen this famous Pepsi ad. I've seen masses of media content about it. I still haven't seen the damn thing, you know, which is, yeah, I mean, it is embarrassing, but it's also kind of telling in a weird way that about, I think advertising is finding it's in a kind of weirdly viscous environment that it's, it might, but this might be a sort of being in China thing, I guess, possibly. What's, has anyone looked at Adam's strange link?
So like, if another thread's not going to come up immediately, I mean, along these lines, I can't help but laugh every week at what we're all doing on Google Hangouts in relationship to this conversation, that it would occur to me that sort of, I don't know, younger people or people with internet subjectivities wouldn't tolerate such idiocy as like Google Hangout. This seems, you know what I mean? Like that there's something already very 20th century about what we're doing.
Right. I mean, it's difficult because I'm such an old fogey that I'm still only now getting used to the amazing facility of Google Hangouts. I mean, when I first kind of got involved with the NCRAP not long ago, and I saw what Google Hangouts was capable of, it completely blew my mind. So I'm sure there is this totally generational factor here. Yeah, I just simply cannot imagine what is there now that is next, so to speak. I mean, I guess in saying you're making your point, John, you must have a sense of at least vaguely of what is out there that people would be using.
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think for me, it's I think that this is sort of like the height of technology, what we're doing with all of its glitches, and that is a certain way that we need to think about technology to accept some of its glitchiness, and that in fact, in the these sort of internet subjectivities, I wonder how much there is a toleration for the glitchiness of technology and its construction and issues of compatibility and process and things, because I mean, all of these too synchronous, too low dimensional, too personal, yes, all of these things. I mean, the fact that even though you're in China and I'm in New York, but we're still like trying to attempt this interface model still, where I'm going to talk into this camera and you're going to look back, you know, all of these kind of things recapitulates sort of, in quotations, you know, human relations, and simultaneously highlights how human relations are already technological without something like Google Hangouts. It's still a circuit that's very, you know, it's a technological overlay onto a quintessentially 20th century set of social relations still. I don't feel like it's remaking the social relation in any significant way, this interface. Whereas some of the contemporary interfaces seem to have more of an effect on that.
Right. Yes. This was part of, I think, Jake's point too, wasn't it? Which I read when Jake was talking about it, and maybe I'm missing part of what Jake's point was, that the existence of these internet avatars is something just totally practical, rather than being a kind of complex, playful, problematic, experimental thing. It's just something totally quotidian and practical, that you have these avatars, you use them without even thinking about them. They're just functional requirements of certain types of activity in cyberspace, and obviously they have the same philosophical structure as the empirical ego. So, you know, the fact that your empirical ego is taken more seriously than any of your internet avatars, at least from a philosophical point of view, seems arbitrary and perhaps techno-sensitive, you know, like that it's by no means inconceivable that with a certain level of sort of deep and continuous immersion in some of these internet channels, that the artificial selves that you're using to mediate your activities will become just as sort of real to you as your own empirical psychological existence, and sort of either alongside it or modifying it or proliferating it or in some other ways taking people through this real psychological crisis in a cold sense. You know, it needn't be something that people undergo as being difficult at all. Maybe the opposite is more likely. But as I say, I don't know whether this was Jake's point at all or something completely separate to Jake's point.
Did you mean when I said that it's like too low dimensional, or was this at a different?
No, earlier on when you were saying about it, I'm going to forget your terms because I've sort of obviously reprocessed it already, so it might be unrecoverable by me now, and as you originally do it.
But like the space of decision, the whole sort of like prosthetic, like second level of like consciousness or identity is just like your partially automated way of interacting with all of these networks and these like different kinds of identities. And yeah, definitely. I mean, that's just, it's interesting you say that because I've been, yeah, the experience on Twitter and like in our sort of corner of weird Twitter that sort of intersects with the News Center and stuff over the last few years has just been like a roller coaster experiment and like exactly that psychology of kind of like losing or splitting yourself into these avatars at like in different ways at different times. And you know, I've found like especially over the last year or so, it kind of reconstructs your sense of intimacy, or creates a whole new sort of construct of intimacy, which is that like, you know, sharing your legal name or your face or something like that with these people, with certain very small element of these people that you talk to in your avatar form like every day, like fosters. I mean, I've found that the handful of people who you know who I am or who I allegedly legally am or whatever on Twitter, like just almost by the act of doing that become like family-like. Like I get like a really strong like libidinal response to having done that, sort of cathexis or something.
Right.
I don't know if
yeah.
else has experience.
Yeah. So this is back to John's thing about this, the kind of how traditional the social relations remain within these media, isn't it? So maybe actually the evolution of it in a certain phase to become more kind of high bandwidth, and obviously according to certain quite explicit imperatives, more sort of personalized medium has resulted in a kind of neo-traditionalist wave, you know, in the sense that from these much more minimalistic, abstracted, perhaps more highly anonymous kind of subject positions, they've tended to collapse back in a way onto prior psychological templates or whatever, as they've been enriched. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely something like that. And sort of in the same vein, if orthogonally, I don't know, I was talking to someone yesterday who has sort of like a startup that's going through its round of funding or something, and he was talking about how somebody in that company flew from New York to Miami for a 15-minute conversation with a potential investor, like face-to-face, because despite all of this telemediation and all this stuff, at least like the versions that we've got, the Hangout version or whatever, like still, as far as like moving large amounts of money or making big decisions,
right,
it still hasn't begun to replace like the face-to-face
Yeah.
handshake,
Yeah.
verification. Yeah,
Definitely. No, this is when I very, very briefly mentioned virtual reality in this kind of list of these technologies, because Balaji Srinivasan has, a very strong sense that VR is going to cross a threshold where it can do exactly what you're just saying and just become a real collapse of geographical space into the net, of a kind that we've not seen, with really high bandwidth, low glitchy kind of VR telepresence that you can just have meetings with such high fidelity on the net that it would make it absurd to to travel in meat space or whatever, in your private jet or whatever to some meeting. It would become completely redundant. Now, I don't know whether that's, I would take it as the sort of prediction that must eventually be 100% right, but you just don't know what the time scale for that is, really. It wouldn't seem crazy to see that as part of a kind of suite of kind of internet applications that we're going to see within a small number of decades at the most.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think it's, in that respect, it's sort of serendipitous that blockchain identity verification, distributed identity verification, is kind of taking off at the same time, because that's the other piece, right? Like the face-to-faceness is one piece, and the knowing, like in the way that maybe irrationally that we feel like we have.
Yeah. No, it could actually be more highly verified. It could be more highly verified and more high resolution. I mean, in the sense that you can call up all kinds of supplementary information to kind of enrich the actual vivid face-to-face encounter, and also, as you say, have strict blockchain verification that you are actually talking to the person that you think you're talking to, rather than, I mean, plastic surgery already probably, doesn't reach, has undermined that level of confidence in meat space or whatever.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you ever saw the movie American Hustle, but like the great hustle or whatever is that they hire somebody to pretend to be a lawyer and stage like an entire like investment meeting with the mob and all of this stuff. And it's actually, the entire thing has been like, is a setup. It's a fake law office, fake lawyer. They're just getting their signature on a document, which is exactly this, you force them their identity in a fake context.
Yeah, totally.
But I think the proliferation of identities or identifications is probably one of the most important features of the internet age, and this VR, the VR you talk about would probably be the kind of culmination of that, where it's a kind of schizoidal process where you can have as many identities as you like and they're all equally realistic in a sense. I think that this will be catastrophic for politics, which depends on, certainly in the kind of liberal political theory way that we think about it, it depends on people having a kind of single rational individual which makes political decisions. Once you get arbitrary numbers of identifications matching up with particular humans, if you like, then this conception breaks down.
Yes. I mean, do you think that it's interesting, like you obviously say about that we've seen sort of hints of this in this last election cycle in the United States? I mean, would you go as far as to say that this kind of this process that you're now introducing is also something that has already begun to work some kinds of political effects, or is that still something that you're seeing as upstream?
I think it's certainly started, and 2016 was, I mean, it's hard to say that the election of Trump was down to any particular one factor, but I think this was probably one factor that led into it. Places like 4chan, where at least ostensibly you can be completely anonymous and you get these so-called hive mind effects. The emergence of the internet as a hive mind into politics is, I think, catastrophic in a kind of specific sense of the term catastrophe.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's interesting in some ways, like that. Obviously, there is also something weirdly traditional about this, isn't there? Like, you know, in a sense that all the American founders had these elaborate pseudonyms, and this whole, you know, so much of these documents of the kind of American independence and liberalism, as we now, as you would say, retrospectively understand it, were conducted with processes that seem echoed in this usage of avatars and anonymous political actors, and but you know, at the same time that there seems to be this element of repetition, obviously there's something also very novel about it. Definitely.
Yeah. Like when you say the usage of avatars, I think this is what the shift into this like new internet subjectivities is signaling, is that we can, I mean, I don't know if we all can, how old people are and things, think of it still in terms of usage, like avatar usage. But I think people who are born sort of into it experience it in an entirely different way. I don't think it's an avatar usage. You know, I think that there's some, if there is some kind of new subjectivity being born with the internet, it's that precisely, that there's no delineation. It's not a tool that you take in hand and operate or something.
I think that's absolutely right, and this also links up to something which I find very interesting, which is, I don't know if any of you have seen these polls that have been coming out regarding Generation Z, or the generation after millennials, basically people who are going to come of age within the next few years. But there are these political polls which say basically that they're extremely right-wing compared to the people who come before them. In fact, they're the most right-wing generation ostensibly since the Second World War. And this applies in France, in Britain, in the US. At least part of the reason for this, and I think one of the articles which I read about this, the researchers suggested this explicitly, is the internet. And it's not a matter of people becoming ideologically right-wing, it's a matter of people becoming desensitized to traditional issues of activism. And the internet is having this kind of massive effect on political subjectivity in that sense.
Right. I mean, can you thicken that out a little bit more when you say desensitized to traditional issues of political activism? I mean, that's a suggestive sentence, but I don't know whether I'm fully getting what's being carried by that.
I'm not sure what the specific mechanisms are, but the general kind of tendency, I guess, that I'm trying to get at is this fact that from clearly with the 1960s, this is when it reaches its kind of climax. You have this idea of basically youth being identified with activism, that people, you know, they rebel against their parents and they end up being very left-wing, whatever. This seems to have now started to disintegrate with Generation Z, and they're not kind of acting out, if you like, in that same way.
Okay, so it's partly it's an absence of rebellion, at least within the kind of psychological structure that's been.
Yeah, in a political sense, yeah.
Right.
Whether there are other kinds of rebellion, whether there's some kind of deep subversion going on here, well, that's another question.
I mean, obviously, you know, it's again a rebellion is a multivalent term, isn't it? But obviously, there is a certain sense where there's a kind of frantic extremity of rebellion that is associated with this, isn't it? In the sense, it's turning over what had seemed to be unquestionable basic structures of you know, consensual doctrines about the nature of society, at the same time that it's ceasing to perhaps have that short circuit Oedipal rebellious character that, as you say, has reproduced a certain kind of culture of, well, I'm tripping over the words here because I want to say culture of dissent, but I think what dissent is obviously being this tumultuous transformation.
Yeah, in in anarchist political theory, going back to Max Stirner, there's this distinction between revolution and insurrection, where revolution is the kind of what we normally think of as revolutionary activity, getting together, constructing new hegemonies, as opposed to insurrection, which is basically people doing their own thing, exit.
Right.
And it seems to me that the internet encourages insurrection as opposed to revolution. So you still have some kind of dissent spirit, if you like. It's not a matter of people becoming orthodox right-wing reactionaries or whatever. It's a matter of people, instead of acting in activist revolutionary ways, they act in insurrectionary ways because that's what cybernetic architecture encourages, I think.
Right. Yes, that seems very plausible, definitely. Yeah, I mean, the sheer speed with it which this transformation has happened, I think, has shocked everyone, hasn't it? Like, to the degree that people had very, very confident expectations about what the space of possibility was in certain respects, that just got shattered by this truck that definitely seems to be, everyone agrees, I think, internet related. And just the level of just trauma coming from just broken expectations, I think is huge. Yeah.
Because it must have something to do, or at least I think it does, with the sort of, or at least I see in the past sort of 10 years, there's been a sort of explosion in certainly right-wing political thought, just in terms of the number of like new movements and, you know, all different strange little communities and you know, new rediscovered ideas and all sorts of things. It's been, I mean, you used the term Cambrian explosion. I think you used it maybe a week or two ago in this course in relation to something else. But I think that has happened. Really, it's because of the internet, isn't it?
Yes, I think so.
I don't see it, or disagree, that there's been a really similar thing happen on the left. It hasn't been as pronounced, you know, in terms of, you know, like you can list at least half a dozen new movements, right-wing movements, ideologies that are brand new. I'm not sure you really can you for the on the left. I was wondering about this and whether the reason for it is that the left is so sort of wrapped up in the academy that that sort of, I don't know, is it stifling in some way? Whereas all these new movements are just on the internet.
I think I disagree on this. I think actually this kind of stunning explosion of ideologies is happening everywhere. It's happening all over the political spectrum, and there is stuff going on the left too. I mean, stuff like all these debates between places like Our Socialism and Leftypol and all these other left-wing forums. The strange revival of Max Stirner, because Stirnerism basically didn't exist a few years ago as a serious cause, as far as I can tell, and is now a huge thing on the internet.
Yeah, and so it's a common internet avatar actually, as well as interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah. But still, I mean, I take what you're saying, but I do think there is something to what James is saying that I mean, I think the academy hypothesis is quite interesting, and I'd also say, well, is there just a kind of cyclic thing because of the fact that, you know, because we've had 8 years of Obama, and you know, there's a certain sense where there was less sense of being out in the wilderness in that sense. I mean, it's difficult because yes, maybe people just don't. There's no consensus on whether this phenomenon exists at all. It is interesting. I guess what to me makes me think there's something there is just the fact that the collapse of a certain sort of consensual sense of what conservatism is, I think, is part of the thing that's shocked everybody. You know, like in America, really recently, it was just like the center of gravity of it, as it's basically very wrapped up with Christianity. It's, you know, sort of doctrines to do with kind of free markets and free trade and consensus on a whole range of things that was just really solid. And I don't think anyone thought that there was a place for stuff to come from, you know, and all of the kind of dissidents to that, the paleo-conservatives, the libertarians, were kind of very stably ensconced at the fringes. No one thought that was going to change. Their candidacies were jokes. And then all of a sudden there seems to have been this kind of core implosion that everyone is saying, what the hell is, you know, even where people don't even know whether you should call it conservatism anymore. You know, what is happening on the right? Now, I'm just not sure I'm seeing anything symmetrical on the left in that sense. I think you'd have to go back to the 1960s. I mean, this notion that there is like something that is just gutting the basic core of what the Democrat Party was about and replacing it with something cryptic and menacing. I mean, is it imaginable that people are seeing that? I don't know. Sorry, I should leave it more open because I guess, you know, perhaps people could see that.
I don't know. I mean, I think that this right-left distinction, we have to always situate it against a kind of tendency that's abstract and not situated against this left-right, and say that for those on the left, you know, the right is constituted by, it doesn't have to be a kind of affirmative position of the right. It can just be constituted by a flowing with the objective tendency, so to speak. So like these new subjectivities, I don't see them as fundamentally right wing. I think Vincent's right about this insurrectionist tendency. It's not right wing, and it's profoundly conservative in the dimension of, I mean, we haven't until today talked much about the social dimension or the dimension of jouissance and things, but because I think they're not necessarily, it's not necessarily, I mean, we're talking about political economy principally, you know, and they're not, the political economy, let's say, determines the social, or has a more determinative dimension of the social in my reading, or of modes of jouissance and such, rather than the reverse. So I mean, we could sort of, I could imagine a world in which we kind of raise a wand and return to prior modes of social relations and things, and nonetheless we still have capital. So I mean, it's a very interesting dimension that we're talking about, that sort of is more of a problem for the left than for, like, if insofar as there is a right, the right cannot be identified with this insurrectionist tendency. So when we talk about libertarians or Christian conservatives or whatever, I mean, they're being threatened with their extinction as well in their proper sense. I mean, people can use that stuff as noise to pursue to support the flow of the objective tendency, so to speak. But like proper, you know, libertarians or proper Christian conservatives, I think, are being threatened with their extinction on some level just as much as any other 20th century tendency, perhaps.
Yeah, I think this is exactly right, and I think to me it seems like the division more and more is basically between people who represent a very kind of serious and officious sort of set of ideologies to do, as you say, with the 20th century and with products of hegemonic construction and so on, and a more kind of insurrectionary, maybe ironical subjectivity, which doesn't really have much truck with this. And this is happening all across the political spectrum as we understand it, and beyond, almost.
I think what we're seeing is a Goldwater-like revolution that's utilizing the language, aesthetics of counterculture. I would make the argument that you know, again, in the group in the inbox, I made the argument that the right's kind of been gaslighting itself since the 90s. I think John is right. Their prior structures are like at the very least they're being challenged. At the very least they're being challenged, and the visibility of like these new voices, the visibility of these new identities, like challenging that, you know, to them they feel that it kind of pushes them to like move like a voting block, because they see themselves as a minority. It allows them to, whereas the left, it has this delusion that since the 60s, it has this illusion that you can reformat the social structure. You can, by integrating yourself with it and continuing it, the social structure will reflect your goals. Whereas you start seeing this in the 90s, the right kind of like it shifted a little bit. Like, I don't know if anybody remembers, but there was a zine, an influential zine in the 90s. It was called Answer Me, and it was written by a couple, Jim and Debbie Goad, and that magazine is an influence on something like Vice magazine. And if you follow Vice magazine, you know that like in 2007, 2008, they kind of outed their founder, Gavin McInnes, who was explicitly trying to create like a quote unquote hipster right.
Right.
You know, like he flirted with, he flirted with paleocons. He would write glowing reviews of Pat Buchanan. He would write for alt-right publications like VII. He had a relationship with Peter Brimlow. He would have someone like Jared Taylor, have a debate with I don't know. Yeah, it was like Jared Taylor and like an anarchist having a debate with each other. And of course the anarchist is some like strung out crusty punk. And Jared Taylor is this erudite New England wasp, well-spoken wasp with Ivy League education. So like, since then, I don't know. Our argument is that the alt-right now is kind of like a revenge of the Audis. And I don't know, there's this, you're right, there's this insurrectionary force that it's able to like kind of incubate itself online. But it appeals to younger people because it's framing itself as we are the new counterculture. You know, that's what I say about that.
Yes.
Is it wrong to present itself as a new counterculture?
No, it's right. I mean, again, the alt-right's it's been my personal obsession since 2006. It's they're not wrong.
It's something different.
It's different. Yes, it's different, and we would say that the alt-right is going to be the new right. Like the closest that you'll have to like the traditional GOP is the Tea Party, and the Tea Party has a foot in the alt-right.
Like Ann Coulter she's really heralded by the alt-right, and she embraces it, and I think she knows like the rhetorical tools that they're using and stuff.
Like the vulgarity is like it's crucial.
It's like a even farther right.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
and the media doesn't get it right either. Like,
but with some,
yeah,
like their description of white nationalism, they conflate someone like Jared Taylor with David Duke, when in reality David Duke is just some 1488er like former Klansman who wants to be Jared Taylor. Jared Taylor is a paleocon. Jared Taylor is a paleocon with like ethno-nationalist concerns. Like they, sorry, go ahead.
What's interesting to me, I mean, Jake mentioned Le Pen in the sidebar. This phenomenon that you're talking about, it's happening all over the world.
Right.
I mean, you look
Yes.
at people like Duterte in the Philippines. In China, you've got this new current of kind of nationalist Maoism that's being incubated in the internet. All across Europe. I mean, I'm half Hungarian. I'm half Hungarian, so I have experience in Hungary where basically the far right completely took over the political spectrum there in a very short span of about 4 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think something is happening at a kind of structural level, I think, which is causing this.
It can't just be internet, but it must be partly internet.
The internet's just the incubation. It incubates it.
But then, well, if you're going to reduce its role that much, then you need an independent sort of planetary catalytic mechanism, don't you? Because it is striking how this is just erupting. I mean, I wouldn't say completely globally. I mean, but I mean, you could even say, you know, there's a relation to Modi and the BJP in India, for instance. I mean, it's like really vastly widespread. So what is the thing that is triggering this planetary right-wing insurrection?
One catalyst could be, and maybe I've only looked at it in connection with the US, so maybe it's not super global, but the connection of authoritarianism to these policies and wants. Because not all, like we think the alt-right and all of these things are connected also to Trump, but like through different channels and ways. And not everyone who votes or voted for Trump was also obviously part of the alt-right. But there's a commonality in terms of like fearing certain things within society and wanting somebody who will enact more harder right stances to protect them or in response to these fears or something like that.
Like, it's a radical normativity, like just, I guess, the normative like constituents, they've adopted like these like Alinskyist these Alinskyist techniques. They're correct to think of themselves as the new radicals. Like, they're honestly, when we say left, it's, you know, it's, I guess it is just relative, because isolating it only to America,
yeah,
you know, our argument that there is no left in America, like the left is just liberal readers of Marx. There are no real Marxists in America. They're just readers of Marx. They're also, I guess, not to depart, but also like with the right, they kind of have centuries of essentialist narratives to like pull from. Like, one school of thought within the alt-right is, and that's like related to NRX, is human biodiversity, which, again, human biodiversity relies on like 18th century theories updated about racial dynamics. You don't get something like the manosphere or something like, or something or it needs that scientific basis. You don't get white nationalism or identitarianism without something like human biodiversity. You don't get white nationalists like Jared Taylor without paleoconservatism.
But what I'm missing from the story I'm getting from you guys is why suddenly, you know, within a small number of years, I mean, really, we're talking, I don't remember when Modi first won. I mean, that was a big shock. So we had this kind of Hindu, identitarian, whatever, I'm going to put some scare marks around it, you can withdraw, like authoritarian Indian government rejecting the whole consensus that had been there in that country since the kind of founding, since independence. And, you know, within that time, we've seen this huge kind of rash of things happening across Europe. And obviously recently, the Brexit upset, the Trump election. I'm happy to bring in Duterte too. I mean, so something has really very, very shockingly suddenly changed.
Well,
and
I'm
not seeing what, you know, that you guys have a causal factor that's giving us any clues about why suddenly these things are happening.
Well, at least like or particularly here, there's all these things that already exist within society. And I think in part, one of the driving forces is the internet creating like fully narrated alternate realities, which I'm going to argue has been happening here for a minute, but like with the internet, you can like exclude other realities from this narrative, and you can completely immerse yourself in only these ideas. And when these ideas are immersed almost fully in fear-mongering and alarmist like terms, you will get people who react very extreme.
Like you need events like 9/11, or recently, I forget, the Islamist who made it was in I forget what Al Qaeda's online magazine's called, but he made his call to arms was like large-scale attacks, centralized attacks like 9/11 can't occur anymore. And one way to kind of like instill fear and like kind of destabilize like the decadent West is to have these like little micro attacks. So you get something like it was prior to the election. Yeah, a little prior to the election, you get in the West Side, 26th Street, 23rd Street. You had this bombing. Yeah, you had this Islamist bombing on 23rd. Then you had the Orlando nightclub shooting.
They've done this narrative, or what we're trying to talk about with like Dylan Roof, and they didn't just talk about like him doing what he did. It was like when you search the terms that he was looking for in Google, you will get like a lot of the white nationalists, extremist rhetoric. Like all these sites will feed you this information that plays off of this idea of white people being
on the verge of extinction.
On the verge of extinction and whatever.
But obviously 9/11 didn't do this, did it? I mean, unless you're wanting to trace the etiology of it back that far. I mean, so that
9/11 definitely catalyzed an era of like hyper nationalism in the US.
Yeah.
Like even in the arts, it started to reflect this. You saw like a revival of things like country. You had alternative country.
People would shame you if you didn't have your like
flag, freedom fries, ridiculous things like that.
I mean, it looks from the outside as if there was a retrenchment onto a fairly conventional and even, at least in domestic terms, more highly moderated conservatism after 9/11.
Right.
I mean, this whole compassionate conservative mantra seems to me like 180 degrees away from anything that would characterize the current wave of things, isn't it?
Well, one thing that I would like to introduce as a possible kind of causative factor behind this is this fairly unprecedented slowdown that we're seeing now of globalization, and this ties in with stagnation stuff that we talked about in the previous seminars. It seems like this political polarization and the places where it's happening in the world tracks quite closely a process of economic slowdown. In particular, trade has started declining for the first time in a very, very long time, international trade. So I don't know whether that's a causative factor or whether it's an interdependent factor, but it's something to bear in mind.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of part of it. I think that there's also the fact that sort of by, I don't know when you'd say 2008, pick 2008. If you look at sort of both sides of the official political spectrum, they were controlled by, both in, you had sort of, if you look at America, the Democrats and the Republicans are really very similar. They're both, they both share ideologies that would be critiqued as sort of neoliberal and globalist from a sort of a nationalist perspective, and I would sort of call them like Fukuyama. That they all shared this, and I suppose the people themselves would probably still like to sneer at Fukuyama, but I think they were in a real sense Fukuyama. That they had this model of sort of liberal democracy, with a bureaucratic administrative state with capitalism, you know, a welfare state. It was that sort of model seemed, it had no one opposing it really. And then as sort of what Vincent was saying is you sort of run into these problems. There's no, everyone has the same point of view overall in relation to them. And so you've got the financial crisis. I suppose maybe 9/11, you know, you could think about that as well. And but there's so at the same time you've got like a convergence of politics around the world. You also at the same time have like a loss of control of people less than ever before, you know, tune into, is it Walter Cronkite, the guy in the US, you know, for the nightly news, and all receiving the same information.
Right.
You have sort of these two things at the same time. You have, you know, sort of like monoculture in politics and also in like the professions and elsewhere. But you have this sort of opening, this opportunity, and yeah, people can create these narratives, these alternative viewpoints, you know, coherent viewpoints, whether it's the I don't know, the Jacobin viewpoint or the Breitbart viewpoint. It's, you know, and anyone can come up with their own one, you know. It's
right. But no, but you see, that
so you get
seems
this
to me moving back
polarization
to the internet again, which I'm very sympathetic to as an explanatory factor. I mean, I totally agree with you on this sense that the immediate preceding epoch was just stunningly compact, wasn't it? And it's the ideological spectrum seemed to have just almost disappeared. And like, so you've got the simultaneous thing of like Bush and Blair, supposedly one is center right and one is center left politicians, and it could almost be interchangeable. I mean, in terms of the fact that complete consensus about solutions to any issue, whether it's geopolitical or economic, or I mean, you could hardly tell any difference at all in their responses to it. So I think that's totally right. But then obviously that just did completely break down. That's what we're seeing now, isn't it? That centrist consensus has completely imploded.
I think because one of the things that Fukuyama predicted was that people might get fed up of the end of the history. Yeah. This is something that I think happened to some extent in Hungary. There was a moment when there were some revelations from the socialist government at the time in 2006, where the prime minister had been saying that they were lying to private meetings of socialist kind of bureaucrats. And that went into the public, and then people just kind of decided that enough was enough, and they were gonna restart history. So the entire political spectrum almost instantaneously collapsed, and then various new things emerged, like the current Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who's a big fan of what he calls illiberal democracy. So these are all new things.
Right.
But it's stunning how quickly that happened, and how it seems to tie into this kind of insurrectionary urge.
Yeah. And it's synchronized. I mean, just to bang the same point everyone's been making, or a lot of people make. I mean, the synchronization of it is truly stunning. Yeah.
So I just wanted to give a time check for people that were reaching the 2.5 hour mark. Actually, we've gone a little bit over it, but
if we could just say one more thing.
Sure.
You could interpret Islamism and its end result 9/11 as something that as a product of like neoliberalism, specifically something in revolt to like a neoconservatism. So it's
It was an articulation of neocon.
And from there you get
I guess what we're saying in response to Land's like last thing that he said about 9/11, what we're trying to say is that 9/11, the like heightened security and ideas there are neoconservative. So it's the idea that we're going to go to other places and spread democracy, but in a way that is like, you know, adopted by this conservative point of view. The alt-right and people within it got disenfranchised and disillusioned with this neocon dream, and thus now you get the paleocon dream, which is close all the borders, heighten security for domestic things, let's make us a little bubble.
Yeah, I do think that's right. That obviously neoconservatism is a massively universalistic ideology, isn't it? And I think that there's been a massive backlash against that.
Yeah, because okay, sorry. Yeah, because when you look at even Alex Jones and a whole bunch of other alt-right figures say a lot like, well, they sold us the idea of weapons of mass destruction, but that was a lie and stuff like that. So it's like differentiating themselves from something within what could be called a conservative current, but it's a different approach.
It's a dissatisfaction with neoliberalism.
Right. Oh yeah.
Sorry, was Kareem? I didn't get it. Were you suggesting that you could lump in radical Islam with these movements? I don't know. It sounds very broad.
Neoconservatism, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was about neocon.
Neoconservatism. It's
right.
Islamism. It developed alongside neoconservatism.
I mean, they're both universalist ideologies, that's for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
yes. Yeah, I'm sort of edgy now on to close things down. I mean, I definitely can be persuaded to hang around a little bit if that's if people have got something they want to do, just talk about.
Last chance for anyone. All right, see you, Derek.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I thought this was a great discussion. It's to me sort of drifting a bit off our core topics, but maybe what you guys decide to talk about is what's going to happen, you know. So I definitely, I'm not going to try and shut the door on that if people want to carry on with this stuff. It's been great as always anyway. So thanks everyone. Thanks Theo for your impeccable performance as always.
Anytime. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So have a good week, everybody.
All right. Thanks everyone.
See you, everyone.
Bye.